Hello, Alex. Peppermint tea, also a good choice. I was contemplating having a mug of tea myself, and then I thought to myself, it's 8:30, and I probably don't need caffeinated tea, and that's the only kind that I have. So, no tea for me. But enjoy your peppermint tea. Yeah, I think there is a certain point that most of us hit in our lives where evening caffeine is no longer a good idea. But it doesn't seem to affect everybody. And it doesn't usually affect me during the day. I can have plenty of strong tea during the day and it's not a problem. But coffee. If I have coffee, that throws me for a loop. Let's get started. So, in our previous session, Vetch managed to successfully steal the egg and has so far managed to conceal it. And there's been this huge storm. Huge storm blow up, causing all of the dragons to be grounded, causing all of the jousters to head back to their quarters to stay dry. And it seems to be an unusually enthusiastic storm. So Vetch has just made sure that Cachette is alright, as Ari has dashed off to his quarters, and Vetch has just sprinted for the next pen where his dragon egg is. He thanked his gods that he had pulled the canvas over the tops of the unused pens. No one had barged into his pen to protect it, and his egg was safe from the downpour. But so close to hatching as it was, he had to see. It was almost not worth it. In the brief time it took him to get from one pen to the other, he was soaked to the skin. He peered through the murk from his vantage point in the doorway, and thought that his egg was rocking, but it was hard to tell. Without getting into the pen, all he could see was that it was all right, that the canopy was keeping it and the sandpit dry. Back he ran to Cachette's pen. He peeled off his sodden kilt and changed to a new one in the shelter of his own little awning. The edges of the awning had become waterfalls, and the sky was so dark it seemed to be dusk, not mid-afternoon. Lightning flickered constantly, seeming to freeze droplets in mid-air for a moment, and thunder drowned out every other sound. He was just grateful that the gust front had been the only wind. A good blow could rip the canvas from its moorings, soaking and cooling the sands, and that might have spelled an end to his hopes. If a chicken egg got chilled as it was about to hatch, the chick died before it could be born. Would the same be true of a dragon? He rather thought so. The storm would have terrified him if he hadn't been so preoccupied with thoughts of his egg. Fortunately, such fury couldn't last long. Before he became too impatient to wait any longer before returning to his egg, the sky lightened, the torrent lessened, the lightning and thunder passed into the distance, leaving behind only a steady, heavy rain, interrupted by brief surges of a real pelting. But his first concern had to be for his primary charge. Cachette could have gotten injuries that neither he nor Ari saw in their haste to get him unharnessed before the storm burst. Vetch dashed across to the sandpit and Cachette's pen, the edges of which steamed from the rainwater that escaped the drains to soak into the sand along the perimeter. Cachette was fine. He was securely wallowed in the middle, buried up to his flanks, his neck stretched along the top of the sand, with his eyes closed. Vetch knew that pose. Nothing was going to get Cachette out of his warm wallow. Not the sweetest bit of meat, not the coaxing of Ari, not the promise of a grooming and burnishing and oiling. Nothing. And at the moment, every other dragon in the compound was probably taking the same pose as Cachette. No one would interfere with him or come looking for him. Not until the rain let up, anyway. Back he ran to his egg. It was rocking. In fact, it had rocked itself right up out of the sand. It must be hatching. No one was going anywhere in this mess. The dragons wouldn't stir, and the jousters and dragon boys were all in their respective quarters at this point. Vetch waded out into the hot sand to the egg, which now was rocking madly. He steadied it with his hands and murmured to the dragonet inside. It paused for a moment, then he heard the dragonet inside knocking furiously at the shell. He passed his hands over the outside, and after examining it carefully, he spotted a place where it was cracking. Ari had said that mother dragons had to help their little ones hatch. A shell hard enough to protect something as big as a developing dragonet was too thick and hard for them to break by themselves. Ari had helped Cachette. Now it was Vetch's turn to help his baby. He'd heard the story from Ari a dozen times. He knew what to do, and he didn't stop to think about it. He just did what he'd been planning in his mind for weeks now. He took the hilt of his tiny work knife and pounded at the cracking spot from his side of the shell. This seemed to encourage the dragonet, and it redoubled its efforts to crack through. He pounded, the dragonet pounded, and it was a good thing that the steady growl of thunder drowned out most sounds, or they would surely have been caught by all the noise they made together. To his ears, it sounded like a pair of carpenters or stonemasons at work, and if it hadn't been for the storm, so much banging and tapping would certainly have attracted anyone within earshot. Finally, just when he thought that the egg was never going to actually break, the dragonet punched through. 2 big flakes of shell fell away. A bronze-gold nostril poked up through the new breathing hole, and the dragonet rested for a while. Vetch let it be, just picking bits of broken shell away from the hole and snapping the jagged edges off to enlarge it. That was harder than it sounded. The shell was like stone, and the edges of the bits of shell were sharp. But the more he opened the hole, the more of the dragonet's muzzle protruded out, the nostrils flaring as it pulled in its first breaths of fresh air. The egg tooth, a hard little knob between the nostrils on top of the nose, like a flattened cone, was clearly visible. The dragonet would slough that within a day of hatching, but it was needed in order to break out. When the muzzle withdrew from the breathing hole, the rocking and hammering started again from within the egg. Vetch watched to see where the cracks were appearing, and helped again, pounding with the hilt of his knife, and grateful that the thunder and rain didn't look as if they were going to stop any time soon. Despite the cold, damp wind, Vetch was sweating, and he kept up a steady murmur of encouragement to the baby within the shell. Vetch confined himself to helping cracks along and chipping bits away from the air hole. He wasn't certain how much, beyond that little, he could help the dragonet without hurting it by forcing a hatch. This wasn't one of his mother's chickens, after all, and even she had been careful with hatching eggs. There was a difference between assisting a hatch and forcing it, a difference which could mean a dead chick or a live one. He had to run off at one point to feed Cachette. The dragon's appetite was not diminished by the rain. The entire time he watched Cachette, he worried. What if the dragonet got into trouble? What if the egg fell over and the breathing hole was blocked by the sand? What if it hatched and floundered out of the sand and got chilled? But this was also an opportunity. He loaded his barrow with more meat than Cachette could eat now that he was out of his growth spurt. The top was the usual big chunks, but on the bottom was a thick layer of the smaller scraps and chopped bits that he got from troughs near where the butchers worked. They called this stuff porridge. When a dragon needed a heavier dose of tala than you could get into it just by dusting the big pieces with the powder, the other dragon boys would mix it with the chopped pieces and blood. Well, that wasn't what he needed the porridge for, and the butchers weren't curious enough to notice what he loaded his barrow with. They were too busy listening to the rain and thunder outside and talking about it in nervous voices. Under any other circumstances, he'd have stayed to listen, but not today. He fed Cachette to satiation, while the rain drummed on the canvas awning. It didn't take long. The dragon wanted to go back into his wallow and didn't dawdle over his food. Cachette yawned and dug himself back into his hot sand when he was done, and was asleep within moments. Vetch quickly checked the corridor for the presence of anyone else, before he whisked the barrow out of Cachette's pen through the cold rain and into the one next door, and found himself looking at a limp and exhausted scarlet dragonet, sprawled on the sands, limbs and damp wings going in all directions in an awkward mirror of Cachette's pose. The damp wings were half under the poor thing, and at his entrance the dragonet looked up at him and meeked pathetically. It could barely raise its rounded, big-eyed head on its long neck. The bronzy gold and scarlet head wavered back and forth like a heavy flower on a slender stalk. The huge, old bronze eyes were barely open, as if the lids were too heavy to lift. To either side, the halves of the egg lay, red-veined on the inside, with a membrane still clinging to them. Vetch parked the barrow under the awning and floundered out into the sand to the dragonet's side. It was bigger than he was, and heavier, twice his size, and weighing about as much as a young child, he thought, though it was hard to tell for certain. It was going to get a lot bigger before it was finished growing, though. He dug a trench in the hot sand, and helped it to slide in, tucking the clumsy, weak limbs into comfortable positions, and spreading the wings out to dry on the surface. It sighed as it lowered its head down onto its foreclaws. Already the anxiety it had shown when it realized that it was alone was ebbing. It was going to be a crimson red, like both its parents, but unlike Coruscant, the extremities were going to be some shade of gold or bronze. Until it got a little older, its delicate skin was going to tear and bruise easily if he wasn't careful with it. Right now, the skin was as delicate as his own, more so in places, as soft as the thinnest lamb's skin. He petted the dragonet's head and neck for a moment, marveling at the softness of the skin. Then he left the dragonet to bask in the heat and rest from the effort of hatching, heaped a bucket with the chopped meat, and returned to its side. It opened its eyes when he returned to it, and its nostrils twitched as it caught the scent of the meat. Its head wavered up. The poor thing looked so weak. But the mouth opened, and the thin hiss that emerged was anything but weak, and had a great deal of demand in it. The mouth gaped wide. It had a formidable set of teeth already, no surprise in such a carnivore. Open-mouthed, it hissed again and whined at him, red tongue flicking out in entreaty. He laughed. "All right, baby, don't be impatient," he whispered, and dropped a piece the size of his palm in the open mouth. He'd worried about whether the dragonet would be difficult to feed. In the next several minutes he knew that this at least was not going to be a problem. The little one snapped its jaws shut on the meat and swallowed. He watched the lump going down its throat with remarkable speed. Then the jaws opened up again. They quickly fell into a rhythm. The baby gaped, he dropped meat and bone in, the jaws snapped shut and the throat worked, and the mouth gaped. It was so easy to feed the little one that literally anyone could have done it. In fact, before it was sated, it had eaten nearly its own weight in meat. It ate until its belly was round, the skin tight, and Vetch could not imagine how it could cram another morsel in. That was when it stopped. It closed its mouth and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since it had hatched. The big dark eyes seemed all pupil. He could see that they weren't, though, that the iris was simply so dark a color that it was nearly black, but the huge dark eyes seemed to draw him in and hold him. He couldn't look away, and didn't want to, for those eyes seemed to him to be the most wonderful things he had ever gazed into. And then it sighed, laid its head in his lap with complete and utter trust, and closed its eyes and went immediately to sleep, without a care or worry in the world. He was here, and he was now the center of the dragonet's world. So long as he was here, there could be nothing wrong. He thought his heart was going to melt. A pent-up flood of emotion threatened to overwhelm him. He squeezed his eyes shut to keep from crying, and just whispered tender nonsense into the ruby and bronze shells that were the dragonet's ears, while he stroked the soft skin of the head and neck with a hand that shook. But he couldn't hold back the tears for very long. Finally they started, and he wept silently, anger and grief that he had held in for so very long, mingling together with joy and relief in those tears, and nothing left to hold them back. How long he cried he couldn't have told. He cried until his eyes were sore, his nose clogged, his belly sore from sobbing. He cried until his throat was raw and scratchy, crying for all he'd lost, and all he could lose now, crying that his mother and father weren't here to see him, in his first moment of triumph since the Tians came. It couldn't have been long, or he'd have heard Cachette hissing for his supper. Certainly it wasn't as long as it felt. But finally, even he ran out of tears. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, careful not to get sand in them, and sniffed. He felt odd, felt as if he had cried something out of himself, and now there was just a hollow where it had been. Can you see me, father? He whispered into the rain, into the vast space between himself and the summer country. Can you see what I've done? Isn't this baby a beauty? The most wonderful thing you've ever seen? The dragonet stirred a little in its sleep and hissed softly. Carefully, so as not to wake it, he began to stroke the head and ears, and as he petted the delicate skin of the brows, he knew that his dragonet was a female, for it did not have the bumps beneath the skin that would eventually form into a pair of skin-covered horns that marked the male. "What shall I call you, baby?" he murmured to it. This wasn't a question he took lightly. Words had power, and names were the most powerful of all words. Words were what the gods had used to shape the world, and whatever he named this little dragonet would shape her. Then it came to him. From her colors, shading from yellow on her belly, through the scarlet of her body, to a deep plum along her spine and at the end of her tail, while her ears and muzzles went to that brazen gold, like the colors of a sunrise. "Avatre," he murmured, "fire of the dawn. I name you for that." She stirred in her sleep and pushed her forehead against his stomach as though in approval. Avatre it was. "Avatre," he sighed with content, and with rain drumming on the canvas above them, caressed the head that rested so trustingly in his lap. Now for the next hurdles, keeping her presence secret and keeping her. But for now it was enough to cradle her and listen to her breathing softly in the rain. He had to feed Cachet again, eventually, of course, but the rain was still coming down, and he knew that not even Ari would come out of his quarters in this out-of-season downpour. So tonight he would not be sleeping in Cachet's pen. He eased the baby's head off his lap, and she woke and looked at him, then yawned, her tongue waggling comically before she shut her mouth. She stared at him for a moment, then made a small noise that he had no difficulty in interpreting as a demand. He had to chuckle at that. Fortunately, there was enough left in his barrow to line her belly, if not fill it, enough to hold her while he went to fetch more food for her and for Cachet. Then it was the same routine again, except that already she was getting the idea that biting down on the hand that was feeding her was not going to get the meat pieces to arrive any sooner, and in fact caused a delay in delivery as the owner of the hand made funny sounds and waggled his hand in the air. This was entertaining, perhaps, but did nothing for a hungry belly. So she learned to be gentle, and learned that when she sucked at the hand instead of clamping down on it, sometimes it would bring a cargo of delicious wet stuff that lubricated the throat and tongue and tasted sublime. The wet stuff, of course, consisted of bits of the livers, hearts, and lungs, prime treats for every dragon because of their rich blood content, but difficult to maneuver once they were cut up unless the dragonet was cooperating. Avatre was a fast learner, even fresh out of the egg as she was, and when he was done, he hardly needed to wash his hands, for she had wrapped her tongue around them and sucked on them until every bit of blood and juice she could get had gone down that voracious little throat. She fell asleep again immediately, and now that her wings were dry, he tucked them in against her body and heaped sand around her to keep her warm and supported. Then he took his barrow back to the butchery. But just as he was leaving the butchery, he overheard something that made him pause for a moment. "Witchery," one of the butchers was saying, darkly. "Alton Witchery. The Haras priest, Urquhart Ray, told me himself. He and the other Haras priests had all they could do to hold the storm back enough that the dragons could land without killing themselves and their jousters." "I don't like the sound of that," one of the others murmured uneasily. "The sea witches have never been able to reach so far before." "Because they never tried to do so on the wings of a storm before." Vetch jumped. That was Harrowket's voice. "Overseer, have you heard anything more than that?" asked the first butcher humbly. "No, you seem to have gotten all the tidings there are to hear, Thotoret. But I don't doubt you, nor do I think that what you said is mere idle speculation. I have never seen a storm like that in growing season. And since the Alton Sea Witch's powers are of the wind and water, it stands to reason that they called it up all out of season." Harrowket seemed very sure of himself, and Vetch saw no reason to doubt him. "It makes every sense, too, when you think what their strategy must be. They have fewer dragons and less experienced jousters than we. They can no longer meet us man to man, so they must get us out of the sky and thin our numbers somehow. What better way than to smash our dragons to earth with an unnatural storm?" Vetch nodded to himself. It made perfect sense. Doubtless the sea witches who had conjured the tempest were even now lying spent within the walls of their temples, and would not be able to move from their couches for days or weeks. For the damage had been done.
And the damage has been done,
Harkat said, in an uncanny echo of Vetch's own thoughts.
No one was killed, thanks only to the grace of Haras and the skill of our priests. But there are torn wing webs and sprained muscles in dragons all over the compound. A dozen will not fly without days of rest, and by then the witches will be ready to send another storm against us.
They will? Gasped the butcher.
Of course they will. It is by far the most effective weapon they have now,
Harkat said, with scorn for the man's obtuseness.
They will hardly abandon it, and I fear we will now have to cease our scouting forays over their land. If a dragon is driven to earth over their territory...
He did not need to elaborate. Even Vetch knew what would become of a Tian jouster, caught by Altan foot soldiers on the ground. He moved off silently, using the door to the barrow storage room to make his exit. At the moment, he had rather that Harkat did not know what he had overheard. He couldn't help but feel some elation. Among other things, if Harkat was right, Ari stood at far less risk of being hurt or killed now in the course of his duties. Cachette was bigger and stronger than any other dragon in the compound now, and he had always been a better and more skilled flyer. It would take more than a witch-conjured storm to hurt him. And if the Altans were going to use storms against dragons, they must have pulled their own jousters back so as to avoid harming them accidentally, which meant that Ari would not be facing anyone in a joust until the dry came, and not even the most powerful of witches could conjure up a storm. He trotted back to his pens, with the rain drumming on his wet hair. He checked on Avatre, but saw she was sleeping as soundly as a dragon could, which was very soundly indeed. So just in case Ari turned up, he curled up on his pallet in the unseasonable gloom. He would have a lot of chores to catch up on tomorrow, but he didn't think anyone would complain or take him to task for them. He'd been all over that courtyard, and he could always claim he'd sprained something, helping bring the dragons in, and had taken to Cachette's sands to bake the aches out. Maybe he'd better lend verisimilitude to that claim by moving his pallet there now. It didn't take a moment. Even in the twilight gloom and the rain, he was so used to doing so after the rainy season, and he was glad that he had, when, not long after, he heard Ari's step outside the pen. "Vetch?" the jouster called into the dimness of the pen. "Here," he called back. Cachette didn't even stir. "I sprained my shoulder getting chains onto some of those dragons." "I thought you might have. One of them marked you, too. Do you need something for the scratches?" Ari made a dash across the open, rain-filled space, and got in under the shelter of Cachette's awning. "It was Coruscant, and she pulled her blow when she saw it was me," he replied, feeling oddly touched that Ari had noticed in the midst of all the chaos. "I've gotten worse from thorns, or the stuff Kefti made me sleep on." Ari sighed and sat down on the edge of the wallow. "Just bake out the sprain, then. You won't be the only one tending injury. There are sprains and even a dislocated shoulder or two all over the compound, and that's just among the jousters. I expect anyone in the landing court is probably nursing some sort of hurt, and the dragons themselves may have gotten sprains when they landed. We won't field but half the dragons tomorrow, nor the day after. It appears that your countrymen have found an effective weapon to ground us." His heart leapt at that. So it was definitely true then. Harkat had been right. But he didn't say anything, and Ari didn't seem to expect a comment. His heart leapt at that. So it was definitely true then. Sorry. "Well, I won't complain," Ari continued. "There won't be any double patrols to fly when we daren't take any dragons over Altan lands. Just the simple runs over our own land, until the great king decides to break the truce and send the armies out again." Vetch's heart dropped as fast as it had risen. Ari had said when, not if. "But since the king has not chosen to favour me with his plans for conquest," Ari continued, still sounding oddly cheerful, "I am not going to concern myself over that until the day dawns. Nor should you. Instead, I am for my honest bed. There's no point in doing anything but follow Cachette's example and catch up on rest. Good night, Vetch." "Good night, jouster," he called off after the retreating form that sprinted out through the door in the rain. And he waited just long enough to be certain that Ari was not going to return, before gathering up a blanket and abandoning Cashette to sleep alone. For tonight, and for every night that he could manage it, he would be sleeping beside his dragon. She stirred ever so slightly as he laid his blanket down on the sand beside her and fitted his body around hers, and she nestled her head in next to his outstretched arm with a movement that brought a smile to his lips and a lump to his throat. "Help me," he whispered to the Alton gods, who, it seemed, could reach into this Tian stronghold after all. "Help me. Keep her secret. Keep her safe."
Keep it secret. Keep it safe.
And the prayer murmured on into his dreams, a prayer that surely, surely they must answer.
I'm not trying to rob you.
Sorry, I just had a Gandalf moment there. Chapter 13. Vetch was helplessly, hopelessly in love. He had never felt like this before, and yet the emotion was one he recognized immediately. There was nothing he would not have done, would not have sacrificed for his beloved. His heart was lost to him and he didn't care. Of course, if all the love songs he'd heard wafting out of the jouster's quarters during feasts and festivals were true, that was pretty much how he should feel. From the moment that Avatre curled her body to fit the curve of his, he was in love. And it didn't matter at all that at the moment probably all he was to her was to be the bringer of food and the one who made sure her itches were soothed and her messes cleaned away. He loved her with a passion the like of which he had never felt before, a passion that shook him to his bones. It frightened him if he stopped to think about it. He had never had so much to lose before. If he lost Avatre, he wouldn't think about that, couldn't waste the time that would be lost if he thought about it and froze in an agony of fear and indecision. He had to concentrate on how to keep her, not on what would happen if he lost her. He'd had some small inkling of how deeply he had fallen that night, when he went to sleep curled protectively around her, with his last thoughts before slumber being a prayer for her safety. It really came home to him when he awoke in the first light of dawning, still curled around her, and looked at the oddly endearing creature that had been entrusted by the gods to his care, and his first thought was a prayer for her safety. Her hot little body was the exact temperature of the sand under both of them, and as she breathed in and out, he felt himself changing the pattern of his breathing to match hers. Then when she woke, just a little, and blinked at him trustingly before going back to sleep again, he knew that he was forever lost. Was this how Ari had felt when he first looked into Cashette's eyes? Rain still pattered lightly on the canvas overhead. It was very peaceful and comfortable, and he wanted to go back to sleep, but he didn't dare. He would have so much work today it didn't bear thinking about, except that he would have to think about it very hard indeed, and right now, in order to plan things properly. Every moment between dawn and dusk would have to be planned and accounted for if he was to get his work done and give her the kind of attention she required. Both Avatre and Cashette would need feeding as soon as it got light enough for them both to wake properly, so he would have to manage to crowd both activities into the same amount of time he normally took for Cashette. Now, even if she was awake, he couldn't feed Avatre now. No one would be at the butchery yet, and neither Cashette nor Avatre would want their breakfast until they were thoroughly awake and their appetites were roused. But there were other things he could do now in order to get them out of the way. For instance, he could slip over to the leather room, light a lamp, and get his quota for yesterday and today done early. Then he could get the food for both Dragon and Dragonet, feed Avatre first, then Cashette. And if the rain cleared enough that Ari showed up for a morning patrol, Vetch would be where he belonged, in Cashette's pen. Then he'd have to clean Cashette's pen in half the time he usually took, possibly feed Avatre again, and certainly clean her messes up, and be ready for when Cashette and Ari came back. Oh, and at some point during that all, he should get himself bathed and fed, somehow. He should, but he knew very well that if anyone went short, it wouldn't be his charges. I can bathe in the water from Cashette's trough. I can eat something on the run. He eased himself away from Avatre, heaped some hot sand up where he had been in order to support her, and went off to get a clean kilt and get to work. He was glad enough of the lamps in their sheltered niches along the corridor. Somebody must have come along and substituted the rainy season lamps for the torches that had been placed there after the rains were supposedly over. Though the sky overhead was getting lighter, it was dark down between the walls. Pardon me. A hiccup burped. Down between the walls. It was strange to be the only one in the leather room. It was quite peaceful, actually, and he found that when he wasn't distracted by the gossip of the other boys, he actually got things done a little faster. By the time he put the last of his pieces in the finished piles, though it was still raining and overcast, he could tell that it was late enough that he would be able to get meat for his charges. He wasn't the first at the butchery, but he was certainly among the earliest, and as he stood in line in the gloom of that overcast morning, listening to the rain fall in the corridor outside, he paid close attention while the butchers and the other boys talked. Now, more than ever, he needed to know what was going on and being said in the rest of the compound. What were the jousters going to do in this out-of-season rain? And if there was talk of Alton witchery, would anyone connect it with him? Their conversations, punctuated by the chack of the cleavers on the chopping blocks, revealed just how much damage had been done to dragons and riders in that frantic dash for home yesterday afternoon. That no one had been killed or even seriously hurt was deemed a miracle, but there were sprains, pulled muscles, and strains aplenty, and as Ari had told him, even a couple of dislocated shoulders among the jousters. He got his meat without any comment from anyone about what he was taking. They were all too busy recounting the near misses and providential escapes, and speculating on what might come next. It was at that point Vetch decided he ought to leave. He felt the long hair that marked him as an Alton serf brushing against his back with a shiver. He quickly took his burden out, shoving it along in front of himself as fast as he could manage without spilling it. In fact, some of that damage to the dragons was proving out rather audibly as the dragons of the compound awoke for the day. As he wheeled his barrow back to Avatre's pen, he could hear the injured dragons as they hissed and whined in pain when they tried to move. From what the other boys said, there were plenty of riders who were just as damaged, including several who would probably choose to see a healing priest. In the course of that mad dash, dragons had been tossed around in the air like so many dead leaves, and some jousters had held to their seats only at the cost of injury. And here he was divided in his emotions. He was immensely pleased that finally Alta had struck a blow against Tia, but these dragons were not to blame for what was going on, and he knew many of them personally. He hated to see them hurt. At least their injuries were only temporary, and Ari and Cachette had come home fine. He soothed his conscience by telling himself that if Alta had sent a storm with more lightning, or could have directed it, there would be a lot worse than sprains and strains. He fed Avatre quickly. She was more than pleased to cooperate in that regard, swallowing as fast as he popped pieces into her mouth, until the skin was tight enough over her belly to drum on. Then she gave an enormous yawn, blinked, and plopped herself down into the sand to sleep. By then the rain had faded to nothing, but he left the canopy over the pen anyway. It wouldn't hurt anything, no one would particularly care, and it would keep anyone flying over the compound from seeing her. Cachette was not only no worse for wear, he was happy to see Vetch, feeling playful and in good temper and appetite. He buried his muzzle in the barrow, and Vetch went to get his harness. Sure enough, Ari did appear just as Cachette was finishing, his flying helmet dangling from one hand. "No more than half of the jousters are going out on morning patrol," Ari said, and at Vetch's worried look he added with a little nod, "Don't be too concerned, it's going to be a short one. We're just checking to see that no troops moved in or sabotage was done under cover of the storm." By then Vetch had finished the harnessing, but rather than have Vetch pull the canopy back so they could take off from the pen, Ari motioned to him to leave it alone, and led Cachette out to the landing court. Is he thinking there's going to be more rain? He might well be, actually. But if the patrol is going to be short, then he'd better get busy if he was going to clean up after Cachette and Avatre, feed the dragonet again, and take care of his other chores. He ran for breakfast, bolted it down, ran back to the pen, glad for all the good feeding he'd been getting, for he was much stronger now, even if he wasn't much taller. He cleaned the pens, filled the barrow, ran with it to the place where the droppings were left. He checked on Avatre, and he woke her to stuff her again, though her belly clearly wasn't empty. Still, his mother always said that a baby could always eat, and she was no exception to that truism, she being Avatre, not his mother. "Hello, Catherine." Then he cleaned her pen and ran the barrow out again, hiding the much smaller droppings among the rest, adding them to the running tally so that no one would wonder why there were more than had been accounted for. Just to fill you in, Catherine, we are now caught up to the point where Vetch has now hatched his baby dragonet, and had called her Avatre. Or Avatre? Avatre. Fire of the Dawn. Then he was back in Kashat's pen, and just in time, for even as he checked to make certain that he hadn't forgotten anything, he heard the dragons coming back in, wings flapping heavily in the still air. They were very early. It was a good thing he'd gone everywhere at the run. When Ari brought Kashat in, the latter was almost as fresh as when he'd gone out. "Leave the canopies on," Ari said, as the dragon ducked his head to come in under the canvas. "We're in for a rather wet season of growing, I'm afraid. Not that I think it's going to harm anything." "It won't," Vetch replied, out of his own experience. "It'll just save farmers needing to open the irrigation ditches as often. At least, it won't as long as it's just rain." "Let's hope, then, that the sea witches can't conjure hail out of the clouds, then," Ari said soberly. "You should be ready for us to come back early this afternoon, too. Until we're ordered otherwise by the commander of dragons, the senior jousters have decided that no patrol is going to go outside of the borders established by the last truce." "Yes, and wasn't that the point of the last truce? That you weren't to fly outside the boundaries?" Vetch asked in his mind, and some of that anger he'd managed to keep bottled up stirred restlessly again. Maybe if you'd stayed inside them, this wouldn't have happened. Maybe if you didn't keep pushing past those boundaries, taking what isn't yours. He shoved the anger back down and just nodded. It wasn't Ari's fault, and Ari was troubled, more than troubled, by the greedy land grabs among those who wanted the borders pushed back still further. "So, short patrols, then?" he asked instead, lifting the saddle onto its rack. "Just over our own lands, looking for trouble," Ari replied, with a twitch to the corner of his mouth. Vetch cast a sharp glance at him, and it occurred to him that Ari didn't seem to be at all displeased about that. But of course he wouldn't say so, not where he could be overheard. And he had to always remember, always, that no matter what, no matter how kind Ari was to him, or what the jouster confided to him, he was still an Altan serf, and Ari was still a Tian jouster, and if he wanted to keep Avatre, he must never forget that. As Vetch laboured mightily to get all of his work done and keep Avatre's belly full that day, the compound itself was full of activity, a great deal of it rather disorganized and smacking of controlled panic. He was getting a hasty bath just before lunch when he heard chanting approach the bathing room, and just as he started to leave, he had to duck back inside to avoid colliding with a procession of what must have been fully half the priests of the great temple of Haras, I think is the pronunciation I prefer, on Temple Road, chanting and setting spells of protection, accompanied by little priestesses with sistrums and boys with drums. It appeared they were determined to cover every corridor of the compound, and in the process get in everyone's way. Every priest wore a striped headcloth with the mask of Haras gleaming from the front, and a falcon pectoral in gold, with a matching belt across his snowy white robe. The priestesses all were in filmy gowns of mist linens, with wide collars of gold, carnelian, and lapis beads, and gold cords around their waists, their wigs done in hundreds of tiny braids, each one ending in a bead, and a lattice flower centered just over each one's brow, with the stem trailing down her back. Behind them came 6 slaves bearing feather fans on long poles, although what they were supposed to do in the chill and the damp, Vetch had no idea. They weren't the only ones either. Racing from cleaning Ari's rooms, Vetch ran into a procession of the priests of Cyrus and Iris, who, not to be outdone, arrived to replicate the first effort. The same sort of procession, with music and magical chanting, only the costumes differed. The priests of Iris wore the horns of the moon on their brows, and their gowns were tight sheaths of red linen that ended just below their breasts, with wide priestesses of Iris, with wide bands of embroidered and beaded material that served as straps running over their breasts and shoulders, while the priests wore helmets much like the great king's war crown, and intricately wrapped kilts with heavy beaded belts. And not an hour later, they were followed by the priests of Nuthis and Thet and Haman, each in their own variations on priestly dress, who all trooped past Kashat's pen while he was feeding Kashat and Avatre.
"A man can't turn to fart without blowing stink into a meddling priest's face today," growled one of the butchers to another while Vetch was collecting Avatre-sized bits for another feeding. Vetch smothered a laugh and quickly. It was funny, but not to the butcher.
By now it was clear that virtually everyone else in the compound but Vetch was worried sick about the way that Alton's sea witches had managed to wreak havoc on the Tian Jousters, so far within the borders of Tia itself, and he did not want to draw attention to himself while people were so unsettled. And unfortunately, nothing that the priests were doing was giving anyone any real confidence that the compound had any more protection on it than it had before all the chanting and the processions. Everyone knew that the real, truly powerful magic went on in the holy sanctuaries without witnesses, and this was just something to make people feel better. Whether that was true or not, Vetch had no idea. Part of him was fiendishly glad that the witches had done their work so well. Part of him wanted to see more damage and fear, just retribution by his way of thinking. It would be a fine thing for these teens to get a taste of fear for a change. But of course, once they started to get over their fear, it would mean trouble for every Alton serf inside the borders of Tia. Not that all that much real damage had been done when you came to think about it. It was only because no one had predicted what was coming, or guessed the fury of the storm ahead of time, that anyone had gotten hurt at all. No one was likely to be even slightly injured the next time the sea witches sent a storm, because now everyone would fly for home the moment that thunderheads appeared on the horizon. And as he pointed out to Ari, rain was not going to cause any harm to the crops. No point in trying to tell that to anyone here, though. They weren't likely to listen. Nerves were on edge, and people were all too ready to imagine that the sea witches could do all manner of dreadful things. What if they call lightning to strike the compound, or the great king's palace? What if they shower us with hailstones the size of pomegranates? What if they make the great mother river to run backward? What if? What if they make pigs to fly and shit on your heads from above? He thought at last, in irritation, overhearing yet another frightened and wild speculation over a hastily snatched dinner. That's just as likely, if not more so. For it didn't seem to occur to anyone that the sea witches had not had much luck at controlling the storm that they had created. They had simply set it in motion and shoved it across the border. Vetch was a farmer's child, and he knew better than most just how much worse it could have been if the Altons had any amount of control over that storm. It was, after all, the season of growing, and Alton saboteurs had already made it perfectly clear that the ruin of Tian crops was high on their list of priorities. If the sea witches had had real control over that storm, it would have been hail, not rain, that pounded down on Tian fields. The crops would spring back from the heavy rain and wind. Hail would have ruined them. Why attack the great king's palace with lightning, when you could make his whole land starve? For that matter, he didn't much want to think what a hailstorm would have done to dragons and jousters in the air. There would have been deaths. Still, all the fuss was a benefit to him. No one paid any attention to what he was doing, how many barrows of meat he took, how many barrows of droppings he left, or where he was when he wasn't where he was supposed to be. Avatre ate and slept and woke and ate and slept again, like virtually any other baby. By day's end, she was demonstrably bigger and heavier. In a way, it was gratifying to see all the work he'd done hauling all that meat had a visible effect. And Vetch purloined some soft cloths and a jar of oil from the buffing pens to keep her skin soft and supple while she grew. Dragons didn't shed their whole skins at once as they got bigger. Instead, they shed their skins a little bit at a time, old skin flaking and falling off, exposing new skin underneath. Tiny scales grew larger, and new scales formed along the edges of old ones. Vetch did not know how a mother dragon kept a dragonet from itching as it grew and shed, but he would have to keep Avatre oiled and buffed, or she'd be driven mad with itching. Her pen was a still pool in the middle of all the chaos, and he went to it as a refuge. She murmured sleepily as he took an oil-soaked rag and waded into the hot sand with her, to stretch out her wings and coat them with oil that soaked into them the way the first rain after the dry soaked into the earth. The scales of her body were tiny, hardly bigger than the grains of sand around her, but they would grow as she grew. He buffed them gently and rubbed the rag over her, and she lifted her head and gave him another of those wavering, limpid gazes, before settling back down to sleep again. He could hardly bear to leave her, but he had work to do, and it was risk enough taking this much time during the daylight hours with her. By nightfall, when all the priests had finally finished their bespelling and prayers, less hysterical personalities managed to prevail within the compound. Haraket kept his head the whole time, of course, and Ari and the more senior jousters seemed to have kept the panic all around them from infecting them. Interestingly, just after supper, some of the older priests of various gods turned up to help soothe some of the hysteria, and that helped. One of the most helpful was the high priest of Haman, who actually turned up at both the kitchen court and the jousters' quarters, and pointed out many of the same things that Vetch himself had been thinking all this time. He arrived in his full regalia, leopard skin cloak with the snarling head over his right shoulder, freshly shaved head, 2 standard bearers standing behind him, and bedecked with so much gold jewelry it made Vetch's back ache in sympathy just to look at it. Supposedly he was the great king's uncle. He certainly had the kingly manner, and that alone seemed to set people's minds moving into calmer channels. So at least, by the time that the sun set, a measure of quiet had returned to the Jousters' compound, if not peace. Things were still edgy and chaotic the next day, and the next, which was all to the good so far as Vetch was concerned. The more people were focusing their attention on what was going on, or presumed to be going on, outside the compound, the less they would notice what was going on inside. Even Ari was so preoccupied that if Vetch hadn't made a point during his cleaning of snatching away the dirty garments as soon as Ari shed them, and making sure the linen chest was full of clean ones, he probably would have worn the same kilt 3 days running. He wasn't in his quarters or out on cachette much, and Vetch could only assume that he and the other senior jousters were engaged in some sort of council with important leaders of the army and the government. Vetch himself was certainly doing enough running. He ran everywhere he went. It was the only way to make everything fit into the day. He worked with one ear cocked nervously for a sound in Avatre's pen. He worried that cachette might betray what was going on with his mild interest in what was on the other side of the wall. Cachette surely scented something or heard it. He tried several times to peer over the wall to see what was there, but the canvas awning on the other side foiled his attempt to look into the wallow, and much to Vetch's relief, he finally gave it up. And Avatre ate, and slept and grew, definitely bigger every day, and the compound held its collective breath, and waited to see if the sea witches were going to be able to repeat their attack. Sure enough, on the 4th day, another of those monster storms roared up out of the north, sending the dragons flying for home before it. This time, however, there were no injuries. As Vetch had figured, the first sight of a thunderhead building up was enough to send the dragons all back well in advance of the gust front. This storm was a little different, too, with a great deal of wind and lightning, but the initial downpour was much shorter, and the light rain and overcast persisted longer, forcing the dragons to stay in their pens all that day and the next, except for brief patrols over Tian lands, and even briefer practice sessions. The exercise was just enough to take the edge off their restlessness. There was nothing to take the edge off the restlessness of their jousters. It was not the season of rains. They were not working on the ragged remains of their strength and happy to have the time to rest. Quite to the contrary, they were fit and itching for action, and to be held confined to the compound by a pack of witches, well, it rankled. They badly needed something to do. Vetch sensed it in the sour looks, sour tempers, and growing tension. He heard wild parties at night in the jousters' quarters, and heard rumors of scandalous escapades among the dancing girls, and of broken furniture. He started taking the most out-of-the-way corridors when he had to go anywhere, and so did the rest of the serfs. He'd seen this mood before, and when tempers flared, well, if there's a choice between a Tian and an Altan serf, no matter who is in the wrong, it is always the Altan who pays. He redoubled his efforts at stealth. He bit his nails to the quick in worry over Avatre. The tension could not last. Something would break, and soon. But he knew that, and he kept telling himself that all he could do was to stay out of the way and hope that it did not break over him. Vetch was eating his noon meal in the farthest corner of the kitchen court, when the noise from the corridor made him whirl and look at the blank wall behind him in alarm. A shiver of fear gripped him as he wondered if all of the stress he'd sensed had finally found an outlet, for it sounded like a mob in full cry. And he wondered who or what was the target for all that pent-up tension, or if they could be coming for him. But then one of the slaves dashed into the court, his eyes wide with excitement and not fear. "A dragonet!" he shouted. "Two of the jousters have brought in a wild dragonet! Come and see!" He dashed out again, followed by a stream of quicker-witted folks, or more curious dragon boys and servants, as a new fear held Vetch paralyzed in his seat for a moment. Have they found a Vatre? He broke the paralysis in the next instant. He had to know. With the others, who were more slow to react, he shoved his way to the door, just as the procession of two of the younger jousters and a small army of slaves came triumphantly by. They were, indeed, hauling a squalling, protesting, blue dragonet, encased in a net and bundled onto a palanquin carried on the shoulders of a team of 8 or 10 slaves. This was a much, much older dragonet than a Vatre. It was easily the size of one of the huge sacrificial bulls of Haman. Its claws had been encased in padding and bags, its legs tied together, its mouth trussed shut. It looked absolutely furious, and Vetch did not want to be the person who cut it loose. "Where are they going?" he blurted, not thinking, not really expecting an answer. "Oh, they'll put it to beast in one of the open pens, and one of the trainers will come and care for it until it's tame," came the answer from above and behind him. "Tame enough for a dragon boy to look after anyway. Harkat won't be pleased. He'll be the fellow who will have to find a boy in all out of season." Vetch looked quickly around behind him, and saw that the speaker was one of the slaves, one that had been reasonably civil to him from the time he arrived. "Why?" he asked, feeling bewildered. I don't know why they're doing that. Why did the jousters even go out after a dragonet, and why go after one that isn't even fledged yet?" The slave grinned down at him and winked. "You've been keeping yourself to yourself these few days, or you'd have heard. The great king sent down a decree to the jousters. If Alta is going to try to ground our jousters, then the great king wants more of them, too many to keep on the ground, no matter how many storms the sea witches raise. So," he nodded after the mob, which had turned a corner, leaving only the noise behind. "Now the most restless of the jousters are going to help the trackers and trappers out, as they used to when there were fewer of them." Vetch blinked. "More dragons?" he asked. "More dragonets, more jousters in training. Both," the slave corrected, and the king's vizier made the little suggestion that since the jousters are grounded, perhaps they ought to be the ones hunting the new dragonets. But Vetch thought about the fury in that young thing's eyes, and pictured to himself the fury of the mother if she happened to return while her babies were being abducted. "Isn't that dangerous?" "Entirely," the slave replied callously. "And so long as no one tells me to go along on one of those hunts, I care not. Whatever it takes to get the young hotheads' minds off making trouble around here is perfectly fine. You would not believe what they've been getting up to in their quarters. The wrestling matches that end in broken furniture are bad enough, and the drunken parties and the wild adventures with all the dancing girls, but there are 4 very angry nobles who had to drag their daughters out of rooms in the compound that they should never have been in, and several more who've been asking pointed questions about where their wives have been and with whom." The slave snickered, "which is probably why the king's suggestion was phrased so near to an order." Vetch could certainly agree with that, but he had to know more, and he decided to go in search of Harkat. Harkat, it seemed, was already in search of him. He spotted Vetch coming around a corner, and shouted his name. Vetch hurried toward him.
"I've 3, God save us, 3 spitting and yowling dragonets, and more to come, and I need you and Fist to help train new surf boys,"
he growled as soon as Vetch came within earshot. He was accompanied by a tall, aristocratic man in a fine kilt, striped headdress, and a simple but very rich neckpiece and armlets.
"God help us, if we don't have some of them killed before this is over."
He shook his head.
"Well, it'll be the stupid ones, or the ones with more bravado than sense, so small loss, I suppose."
"No loss," said the stranger, who had the deep-set eyes, the beaky nose, and the stern look of one of the statues of the great king. He looked down at Vetch. "So this is your little surf boy, Harkat? The one who makes dragons love him?"
"The very one,"
Harkat replied, with a hint of a smile. Vetch, meanwhile, felt himself held in the man's powerful gaze. Whoever this was, Vetch felt like a mouse between the paws of a cat. He knew he should avert his gaze and stare at the ground in respect, but he couldn't look away. He was fascinated and terrified at the same time by this man, a powerful man, an important man, a man who could order my death and be obeyed on the spot. How he knew that, he didn't know, but he knew instantly that it was nothing less than the truth. It felt as if his mind was being rummaged through. Desperately, he kept his thoughts on Cachette, on Coruscant, on all of the dragons he'd been making friends with, a little at a time. "So, boy, the man said, speaking directly to Vetch, as no Tian noble had ever done before. How do you make dragons love you? Is it some witchery? Vetch gulped. Witchery? Oh gods, that was the last thing he wanted anyone to think. I'm good to them, Lord, he whispered. Patient, careful. I give them treats, show them the pleasures of being obedient, let them become my friend. I coax them to be good. He fumbled for the words to describe what he was doing and failed. I like them, he said desperately. To his shock, the man tossed back his head in a bellow of laughter, freeing him from that paralyzing gaze. The stranger slapped Harrowket's back. Harrowket actually staggered. A good answer, a true answer, the man said, still laughing. So speaks any good tamer of animals. Well enough, Harrowket. Find me more such as this boy, and I authorize you to take as many boys, be they free, slave, or serf, as you need for the new Jouster 100. You undertake that, I will find you jousters who are neither too bold nor too foolish, even if I have to take them from the fields and the quarries to find sensible men of courage to fill those saddles. And if our nobles are offended by this, and feel I have demeaned their feckless sons by allowing peasants and labourers to serve alongside them, well, they can come and quarrel with me. With that, the man strode away through the mist and rain, paying so little heed to the weather that it might as well have been bone dry.
That, young Vetch, Harrowket said with satisfaction, is the commander of dragons, who just happens to also be the great king's 7th son by one of his lesser wives. And if our young hotheads can actually manage to steal so many dragonets from the nest, and I am forbidding them to take more than one from any nest, then we are about to double our strength to a full 100, and perhaps more. Though where I'm to find so many dragon boys who have experience, boys who are not intimidated or afraid of dragons.
Shouldn't they just love animals and understand them? Vetch said without thinking.
What?
Harrowket said, startled. Someone like Fisk. Once again, he knew what he wanted to say, but didn't have the words for it. He loved his goats. He knew how to see what they were going to do by the way they acted. He floundered, but Harrowket's eyes lit up. It's not like dragonets are as big as grown dragons. Even one the size of an ox is still just a baby, after all. And he said you could take serfs or slaves, and serfs and slaves are always doing the dirty work around animals.
You could be right, boy,
Harrowket mused aloud.
Perhaps dog boys, the ones that tend the hunting packs. They live, sleep, even eat with their packs. Dog boys will know how to care for a young thing, even a dragon. By the gods, I see what you mean. They're out there invisible, because none of us ever look at them.
Harrowket exclaimed.
The boys that tend camels, the ones that care for the sacred animals in the temples, or the great king's menagerie. Good gods! All those slaves and serfs we never even look at, living under our very noses. The boys that tend the Kefis bulls are surely no strangers to big dangerous beasts, and Haman can spare us a few of them, I should think.
He nodded with satisfaction.
Good. I'll find the boys. You get back to your duties, and when I've gotten a clutch, you and Fisk can pick out the ones that are any good.
Vetch went back to his duties with most of his questions answered, and as he went to get meat for Cachet and Avatre, he encountered a harried-looking adult in the doorway of the butchery. The man was pushing a barrow filled with small chunks, none bigger than his hand, and Vetch realized that this must be one of the dragon trainers, men he had not yet actually seen, the ones who would attend to the dragonets until Harrowket could find boys to take over the job. He did not look happy. Oh, I've only got 30 seconds left on Instagram. So, Instagram, I'm going to end the stream and then restart it. Tune back in just a minute or two as soon as I posted it. Facebook, sit tight. And now, I will put on some waiting music in the meantime. Let's go here, whatever. Good.
How would you define a luxury watch?
I don't want waiting advertisements.
Exclusive.
Waiting music. There you go. Posting, posting, posting. Come on, Instagram. Do your stuff. Just thinking about posting here. There we go. We'll just wait a minute for our friends to rejoin us, and then we'll finish off the chapter. We've only got 4 or 5 more pages. All right. Hello, Sydney. All right, let's finish up the chapter. I'm just going to pause my music here. There we go. Back to the chapter. Right. He did not look happy. Vetch could well imagine why. This was more or less his season of leisure, and it had been seriously curtailed. At least this was more confusion to hide what he was doing. Provided, of course, that someone didn't try to put a dragonet in the pen that Avatre was already in, and find her and start to ask questions. So subtract one worry, add another. By nightfall there were 5 dragonets in pens in the compound, none of them nearly as young as Avatre, but not near fledging yet either. Vetch didn't have the time to look oh, there's a typo there, to look at any of them, though he heard that they were all about the size of the first one, as wild as lion cubs, and as ready to take off limbs before their first taste of Tala calmed them. Khorasan must have made it late in the season, if these were the size of dragonets out in the wild. By nightfall, too, Harkat had found a round dozen new dragon boys, and to Vetch's great relief, he and Fisk were not going to have to train all of them. Half, in fact, were freeborn, and Harkat deemed it more appropriate that they be trained by their peers instead. The ones that Fisk and Vetch met with the next day were all from the great king's palace, and the households of 1 or 2 of his nobles, and all were dog boys but one, who tended the great king's falcons. This was a much, much older boy. Not even a boy, really, for he must have been at least 17 or 18, and he proved to be a great surprise to all concerned. Harkat brought them all to the pen containing a young dragonet of a rich golden-brown colour, again roughly the size of a fully grown bull, that had been chained in place and was ignoring the barrow full of meat within its reach. His eyes were furious, and even Vetch was taken aback by the intelligent rage that was in them. But the older boy wasn't in the least fearful. "So this is a dragonet?" he asked, looking at the young beast measuringly. "My lord Harkat, I asked to come here. I had some thoughts, you see, and I wanted to see if I was right. If you would let me." Much to everyone's shock, including Harakat's, he had come prepared with a novel approach to taming a young dragon, and he was fully prepared to test it. When Harkat nodded speechlessly, he looked immensely satisfied. "Thank you, my lord," he said. Then he simply walked into the pen with the young dragonet, with great steadiness and aplomb, fixing it with a challenging gaze. This clearly took the young thing aback. As it fanned its wings wide in confusion and backed away from him, the boy took 3 swift steps and a lunge, and popped a bag with a hole in it over the surprised creature's head. While it went rigid in surprise, he worked the hole around to where the dragonet's muzzle was, got the golden-brown muzzle poking out of the bag so the dragonet could breathe, and tied the bag's mouth around the dragonet's neck to keep it in place. It went suddenly still, and Vetch and the others could see its muscles relaxing. "Good," the boy said with satisfaction. "They are like falcons, then. My lord, falcons rely on sight, and I guess these beasts do too. If they can't see, they don't fight you." And he picked up a piece of Tala-dusted meat and slid it along the dragonet's mouth, teasing the corner of the mouth until the jaws opened a little, then popped the juicy chunk inside. There was a sound of surprise. Then the mouth snapped shut and the jaw and the throat worked. By now, even the trainer was watching in shock.
He hasn't eaten all day,
The man exclaimed. The boy just shrugged. No more do some falcons, taken from the nest too old to decide that a man's just a funny sort of mother. This works with them, though we use a leather thing that we call a hood instead of a bag. Between the bag and the talla, they'll tame in a week, I guess, and maybe sooner. The trainer shook his head, though in amazement rather than disbelief. Let me get the others, he said, and when he returned, it was with at least 10 trainers. By that time, the rest of the boys had gathered around this older one, who was slowly feeding the dragon bits of meat, talking all the while in a calm voice. The falcons haven't the mind of these fellows, he said. They just go straight into a trance when the hood's on their heads. Look, he's figured out already that I've got food, and now that he can't see me, he isn't afraid anymore, and his gut's telling him how hungry he is. Sure enough, the dragonet no longer had his jaws clamped shut. As soon as he swallowed the last bit, he gaped again for the next one. He's not in a trance, but as long as he can't see me, it's not so bad for him, the young man continued. He's hungry enough that he'll put up with my voice, so long as he keeps getting fed. Now, if I were the one in charge, that's what I'd say to do. Treat them like young ayasas. Keep them hooded for the next couple of days. Only feed them when they're in the hood, and after a couple of feedings, start to handle them all over between each bite, so they'll get used to hands as well as voices.
And then?
Harket's voice boomed from behind Vetch. Then I'd make him skip a meal so he's good and hungry, then take the hood off, and make it pretty clear that if he doesn't take the food from me, he won't get any. The young man seemed pretty sure of his course of action, and Vetch was quite impressed. Never had talla to use on falcons, but if it works like you say, Lord, he may tame down in a day or two, not a week.
Try it, Bacon.
Harket ordered.
Bacon. I don't want to say his name is Bacon. Try it, Bacon.
Harket ordered instantly.
And if he tames as well as you say, you will be in charge of training these others. What's more, at the end of the year, if the training of dragonets and boys works out properly, I'll free you, and you'll begin serving here at a freedman's pay.
The young man's eyes gleamed in a way that Vetch understood perfectly well, and a wave of raw envy came over him that nearly made him sick. Freed. Harket was going to free this boy. How much would Vetch do if only he could have freedom at the end of it? But of course he never would, never could. You won't get any cachettes out of this, Bakken warned. I've heard about that cachette. At best these dragons will be proper tame, like the best of the ones you've got.
That will do,
the overseer replied.
That will certainly do. Now explain to the boys and the trainers how you handle the young falcons, and how you think it should apply to the dragonets. Vetch, Fisk, you can go back to your duties.
Vetch was not sorry to go back, for he was already worried about Avatre again. But mingled with relief was such bitter envy at Bakken's good fortune that it tasted like bile in his throat. That wasn't fair to Bakken. He didn't know the young man, and Bakken was clearly kind to the falcons in his charge, competent, and eager to tame the dragonets in the most humane way possible. But it was so cruel to see freedom offered to someone so nearly in his own circumstances, and know it would never be offered to him. But he won't have Avatre, he reminded himself, as he took a quick peek into her pen, and assured himself that she was still asleep. He doesn't have her, and I have to make sure he never shall. That's the end of chapter 13. We shall... Tomorrow I probably won't be able to do a reload because I will be in transit to my folks' place. So tomorrow we'll take a break. Friday I will be back. If the internet doesn't permit it there, then I will let you all know. And probably what I will do is I will pre-record it and then upload it, so you still get a daily dose of reading aloud. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. I will see you on Friday at the regular time, 8:30. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you Friday.